Hello, my name is Michael, and I obsess. I come across something that grabs me and I consume until I can't take anymore, and then I'm on to the next. Some obsessions last a week, others a lifetime. It is my intention to explore these obsessions with you as they occur while the passion is hot. Welcome to Eclectic Obsessions. I can't remember how I'd heard about this book. At the time, I had never read anything like it. What had started out as an interesting historical mystery took so many insane twists that I didn't recognize the end from the beginning. We will be exploring Holy Blood, Holy Grail on this episode of Eclectic Obsessions.
Here at the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris, there is an obscure little book of great interest to searchers for the truth of Rennes-le-Château. There are pages of detailed family trees which attempt to establish a line of descendants from King Dagobert II, to whom Saunier's supposed treasure is claimed to have belonged. But on another page, there is a fascinating list of names, which includes that of the most famous alchemist of the Middle Ages, Nicolas Flamel, listed here at number 16. Other equally remarkable names appear. Number 20, Leonardo da Vinci. Number 27, Isaac Newton. And finally, Victor Hugo, Claude Debussy, Jean Cocteau. What do these famous men have in common, at least according to this list? Let me remind you of the mysterious letters P.S., which were on the Blanchefort gravestone and on one of the parchments. I suggested that they might possibly represent a secret order, the Priory of Zion, and this list of names is of the alleged Grand Masters of that order, an order which this document claims was founded by the Knights Templars themselves, the Templars who were accused at their trial of denying Christ and trampling on the cross. On another page, we find this strange coat of arms, which makes yet one more link in our chain of clues. Beneath it, there is the motto, Et in Arcadia ego, the link with the sculpted monument at Shugborough, copy of the Poussin painting, which shows the tomb near Rennes-le-Château, where this gravestone was effaced by Saunier, who compounded a mystery in his church, where a hollow altar pillar had hidden cryptic parchments which spoke of the devil whom Saunier placed in his church. This priest, who from penury became rich, and yet stayed to minister in the little village church, above whose door he had carved the warning that this place is terrible. Did Saunier's riches come from treasure? Wealthy and distinguished people visited him. Is it possible that some of them, who provided him with all he needed, were his fellows in a secret society of the occult? On his deathbed, he made a confession that profoundly shocked the priest who heard it. Did he admit that, though a priest, he acknowledged, like his heretical forebears, the supremacy of the devil? He knew that after his death, people would speculate on and search for the source of his wealth. And that search has led me down a tortuous trail. For too long, I had threaded a labyrinth, at the heart of which was a simple truth. Simple, obvious, and staring.
The Holy Blood and the Holy Grail, published as Holy Blood, Holy Grail in the United States, is a book by Michael Begant, Richard Lee, and Henry Lincoln. The book was first published in 1982 by Jonathan Cape in London as an unofficial follow-up to 3 BBC Two TV documentaries that were part of the Chronicles series. The paperback version was first published in 1983 by Corgi Books. A sequel to the book called The Messianic Legacy was originally published in 1986. The original work was reissued in an illustrated hardcover version with new material in 2005. In The Holy Blood and the Holy Grail, the authors put forward a hypothesis that the historical Jesus married Mary Magdalene, had one or more children, and that those children or their descendants emigrated to what is now southern France. Once there, they intermarried with the noble families that would eventually become the Merovingian dynasty, whose special claim to the throne of France is championed today by a secret society called the Priory of Sion. They concluded that the legendary Holy Grail is simultaneously the womb of Mary Magdalene and the sacred royal bloodline she gave birth to. An international bestseller upon its release, The Holy Blood and the Holy Grail spurred interest in a number of ideas related to its central thesis. Response from professional historians and scholars from related fields was negative. They argued the bulk of the claims, ancient mysteries, and conspiracy theories presented as facts are pseudo-historical. The book's ideas were considered blasphemous enough for the book to be banned in some Catholic countries. In a 1982 review of the book for The Observer, novelist and literary critic Anthony Burgess wrote, "It is typical of my unregenerable soul that I can only see this as a marvelous theme for a novel." Indeed, the theme was later used by Margaret Starbird in her 1993 book The Woman with the Alabaster Jar, and by Dan Brown in his 2003 novel The Da Vinci Code. One of the books that the authors claim influenced the project was L'Or de Rennes, later republished as Le Trésor Maudit, a 1967 book by Gérard Dessed with the collaboration of Pierre Plantard. After reading it, Henry Lincoln persuaded BBC Two's factual television series of the 1970s, Chronicle, to make a series of documentaries which became quite popular and generated thousands of responses. Lincoln then joined forces with Michael Begant and Richard Lee for further research. This led them to the pseudo-historical Dossiers Secrets at the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, which, though alleging to portray hundreds of years of medieval history, were all actually written by Pierre Plantard and Philippe de Chercy, under the pseudonym of Philippe Toscan du Plantier. Unaware that the documents had been forged, Begant, Lee, and Lincoln used them as a major source for their book.
There I was, having read the way through the book, looking at the reproductions of two of the parchments which the priest had apparently found, and there it was, a passage from the Gospels in Latin, which talked of Jesus walking in the cornfields with the disciples, and they did rub the ears of corn and did eat. And suddenly I find myself reading off a message in French, very simple. It was hidden in a way that I've always described as a schoolboy code. It was so easy to find. And it simply said, "This treasure belongs to Dagobert II, king, and to Zion, and he is there dead." One of the first questions I asked him was, "Why didn't you publish the hidden message in the parchments?" And he said, "What message?" That struck me as being a very curious response, because I thought he must know it was there. And if he knew it was there, then he'd know that I knew it was there. So we fenced around this for a little while. And eventually we got to the point where we both knew that we were talking about the same message. So I repeated the question, "Why didn't you publish it?" And he said, "Because we thought it might interest someone like you to find it for yourself." And that was an extraordinary response. I thought I was dealing with a simple little treasure hunt story set in a village. And yet suddenly there was a we in the background who thought it might be of interest to someone like me. There was something odd in the background, and I could sense it from that moment on.
Comparing themselves to the reporters who uncovered the Watergate scandal, the authors maintain that only through speculative synthesis can one discern the underlying continuity, the unified and coherent fabric which lies at the core of any historical problem. To do so, one must realize that it is not sufficient to confine oneself exclusively to facts.
And the three of us began to research in more depth and cover much more ground of what the story was all about. And that led eventually to the hypothesis, which we presented in a book published in 1982, and which was called The Holy Blood and the Holy Grail. Now, it seemed very much a case that that book touched a nerve back in 1982, part of the zeitgeist, if you like. it created a huge reaction. It became a bestseller immediately. We were on the front pages right around the world because we had developed an hypothesis which appeared to explain all the background to this apparent treasure story.
In The Holy Blood and the Holy Grail, Begant, Lee, and Lincoln posit the existence of a secret society known as the Priory of Sion, which is supposed to have a long history starting in 1099 and had illustrious Grand Masters including Leonardo da Vinci and Isaac Newton. According to the author's claims, the Priory of Sion is devoted to installing the Merovingian dynasty, which ruled the Franks from 457 to 751 on the thrones of France and the rest of Europe. It is also said to have created the Knights Templar as its military arm and financial branch.
Is the Priory of Zion a genuine secret society, an organization hidden in the background and manipulating affairs? Well, there's no way of knowing. One of the key things about a secret society is that it's secret, and so we don't know what they know. All that we know is that an organization surfaces in the 1950s, calling itself the Priory of Zion and lodging its statutes with the authorities in animas. So before that registration in the 1950s, we have no certainty about this organization at all. We only have what the members of this organization have chosen to tell us.
The authors reinterpreted the Dossier Secret in the light of their own biblical obsessions. Contrary to Plantard's initial Franco-Israelist claim that the Merovingians were only descended from the tribe of Benjamin, they asserted that the Priory of Sion protects Merovingian dynasts because they are the lineal descendants of the historical Jesus and his alleged wife Mary Magdalene, traced further back to King David. According to them, the legendary Holy Grail is simultaneously the womb of Saint Mary Magdalene and the sacred royal bloodline she gave birth to, and the Church tried to kill off all remnants of this bloodline and their supposed guardians, the Cathars and the Templars, in order for popes to hold the episcopal throne through the apostolic succession of Peter without fear of it ever being usurped by an anti-pope from the hereditary succession of Mary Magdalene.
And in the early Grail stories, the Templars were referred to as the guardians of the Grail and the Grail family. It was the protection of a family which led to the idea of a bloodline, which gave us the dramatic hypothesis of a blood descent from Jesus, and that Jesus, unlike the image we get from him in the Gospels, was in fact married, and that he was married to Mary Magdalene, and she was the Grail. The Grail is, in most of our thinking, a cup or a chalice which supposedly either was used by Jesus at the Last Supper or at the crucifixion, which caught the drops of his blood. But our hypothesis shifted it into another dimension. When we first encounter the Grail in the Grail stories, it's not a holy grail. It's presented as a thing, one word, sangral, S-A-N-G-R-A-A-L, sangral. And because there was a word like graal, which meant cup or chalice, that one word was split into two, sangral, holy chalice. And that's where that idea comes from. But if you break it one letter later, you have sang royal, which is royal blood. And so we have a bloodline, a blood descent. And with the thought of a marriage between Jesus and Mary Magdalene, the Grail is now the womb of the Magdalene. She bears the blood of Jesus and creates the bloodline of their descent. And so the secret messages that the priest apparently had found began to make sense in a different context. This treasure belongs to Dagobert II, king, and to Zion, and he is their dead. Are we talking about a blood descent, Dagobert II, the last effective king of the Merovingian dynasty of France, and were they the blood descendants of Jesus?
The authors therefore concluded that the modern goals of the Priory of Sion are the public revelation of the tomb and shrine of Sigebert IV, as well as the lost treasure of the temple in Jerusalem, which supposedly contains genealogical records that prove the Merovingian dynasty was of the Davidic line, to facilitate Merovingian restoration in France, the reinstitutionalization of chivalry and the promotion of pan-European nationalism, the establishment of a theocratic United States of Europe, a wholly European empire politically and religiously unified through the imperial cult of a Merovingian great monarch who occupies both the throne of Europe and the Holy See, and the actual governance of Europe residing with the Priory of Sion through a one-party European parliament. The authors also incorporated the anti-Semitic and anti-Masonic tract known as the Protocols of the Elders of Zion into their story, concluding that it was actually based on the master plan of the Priory of Sion. They presented it as the most persuasive piece of evidence for the existence and activities of the Priory of Sion by arguing that the original text on which the published version of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion was based had nothing to do with Judaism or an international Jewish conspiracy, as it issued from a Masonic body practicing the Scottish Rite, which incorporated the word Zion in its name. Per Begint et al., the text was not intended to be released publicly, but was a program for gaining control of Freemasonry as part of a strategy to infiltrate and reorganize church and state according to esoteric Christian principles. After a failed attempt to gain influence in the court of Tsar Nicholas II of Russia, Sergei Nihilus was supposed to have changed the original text to forge an inflammatory tract in 1903 in order to discredit the esoteric clique around papists by implying that they were Judo-Masonic conspirators. But he ignored some esoteric Christian elements which hence remained unchanged in the published anti-Semitic canard. The 2003 conspiracy fiction novel The Da Vinci Code by Dan Brown makes reference to this book, also liberally using most of the above claims as key plot elements. Indeed, in 2005, Begint and Lee unsuccessfully sued Brown's publisher Random House for plagiarism on the ground that Brown's book makes extensive use of their research and that one of the characters is named Lee, has a surname Teabing, which is an anagram of Begint, and has a physical description strongly resembling Henry Lincoln. In his novel, Brown also mentions Holy Blood, Holy Grail as an acclaimed international bestseller and claims it as a major contributor to his hypothesis. Perhaps as a result of this mention, the authors, minus Henry Lincoln of Holy Blood, sued Dan Brown for copyright infringement. They claimed that the central framework of their plot had been stolen for the writing of the Da Vinci Code. The claim was overturned by High Court Judge Peter Smith on April 6, 2006, who ruled that their argument was vague and shifted course during the trial, and was always based on a weak foundation. It was found that the publicity of the trial had significantly boosted the sales of Holy Blood, according to figures provided by Nielsen Bookscan and Bookseller magazine. The court ruled that, in effect, because it was published as a work of alleged history, its premises legally could be freely interpreted in any subsequent fictional work without any copyright infringement.
And we come to 2002, 20 years later, when a thriller is written called The Da Vinci Code, which picks up the hypothesis from our book and turns it into a thriller.
Robert Anton Wilson's 1985 The Historical Illuminatus Chronicles novel The Widow's Son elaborates on the Holy Bloodline theory by identifying Jesus and Mary Magdalene as the bridegroom and bride in the alchemical marriage of Christian Rosicross, and Merovec as the titular widow's son from Masonic lore, and positing that the entire bloodline is descended from alien-human hybrids. The 1988 novel Foucault's Pendulum by Umberto Eco mentions the Jesus and Mary Magdalene hypothesis in passing. A quote from the book is one of the chapter headings. However, Eco, a secular humanist, takes a negative stance on such conspiracy theories. Foucault's Pendulum was a strong debunking of themes found in the Holy Blood and Holy Grail through the medium of satire. The 1996 video game Broken Sword: The Shadow of the Templars references the book in dialogue when the player asks what a character knows of the Templars. The 2008 documentary film Bloodline by Bruce Burgess, a filmmaker with an interest in paranormal claims, expands on the Jesus bloodline hypothesis and other elements of the Holy Blood and the Holy Grail. Accepting as valid the testimony of an amateur archaeologist, codenamed Ben Hammett, relating to his discoveries made in the vicinity of Rennes-le-Château since 1999, Burgess claims to have found the treasure of Berenger Saunière, several mummified corpses, one of which is allegedly Mary Magdalene, in 3 underground tombs created by the Knights Templar under the orders of the Priory of Sion. By March 21, 2012, Ben Hammett confessed and apologized on a podcast interview using his real name of Bill Wilkinson that everything to do with the tomb and related artifacts was a hoax, revealing that the actual tomb was now destroyed, being part of a full-size set located in a warehouse in England. The claims made in The Holy Blood and the Holy Grail have been the source of much investigation and criticism over the years, with many independent investigators such as 60 Minutes, Channel 4, Discovery Channel, Time Magazine, and the BBC concluding that many of the book's claims are not credible or verifiable. Pierre Plantard stated on a Jacques Pradel radio interview on February 18, 1982, "I admit that The Sacred Enigma, French title for The Holy Blood and the Holy Grail, is a good book, but one must say that there is a part that owes more to fiction than to fact, especially in the part that deals with the lineage of Jesus. How can you prove a lineage of 4 centuries from Jesus to the Merovingians? I have never put myself forward as a descendant of Jesus Christ. There are no references to the Jesus bloodline in the Priory of Sion documents, and the link exists only within the context of a hypothesis made by the authors of The Holy Blood and the Holy Grail. From the Conspiracies on Trial, the Da Vinci Code documentary, the authors of the 1980s bestseller The Holy Blood and the Holy Grail reinterpreted the dossier in the light of their own biblical obsessions. The secret buried in the documents ceased to be the Merovingian bloodline and became the bloodline of Christ. The genealogies led to Christ's descendants. While Pierre Plantard claimed that the Merovingians were descended from the tribe of Benjamin, the Jesus bloodline hypothesis found in The Holy Blood and the Holy Grail instead hypothesized that the Merovingians were descended from the Davidic line of the tribe of Judah. Historian Marina Warner commented on The Holy Blood and the Holy Grail when it first published, "Of course there is not much harm in thinking that Jesus was married, nor are these authors the first to suggest it, or that his descendants were King Pippin and Charles Martel. But there is harm in strings of lurid falsehoods and distorted reasoning. The method bends the mind the wrong way, an insidious and real corruption." Prominent British historian Richard Barber wrote, "The Templar Grail myth is at the heart of the most notorious of all the greatest pseudo-histories, The Holy Blood and the Holy Grail, which is a classic example of the conspiracy theory of history. It is essentially a text which proceeds by innuendo, not by refutable scholarly debate. Essentially, the whole argument is an ingeniously constructed series of suppositions combined with forced readings of such tangible facts as are offered." In 2005, Tony Robinson narrated a critical evaluation of the main arguments of Dan Brown and those of Begant, Lee, and Lincoln, The Real Da Vinci Code, as shown on Channel 4. The program featured lengthy interviews with many of the protagonists. Arnaud de Sade, son of Gerard de Sade, stated categorically that his father and Plantard had made up the existence of a 1,000-year-old Priory of Sion, and described the story as piffle. The program concluded that, in the opinion of the presenter and researchers, the claims of Holy Blood were based on little more than a series of guesses. The Priory of Sion myth was exhaustively debunked by journalists and scholars as one of the great hoaxes of the 20th century. Some writers have expressed concern that the proliferation and popularity of books, websites, and films inspired by this hoax have contributed to the problem of conspiracy theories, pseudo-history, and other confusions becoming more mainstream. Others are troubled by the romantic reactionary ideology unwittingly promoted in these works. Historian Ken Monshon ridiculed the idea of a Jesus bloodline, writing, "The idea of keeping the family tree pruned to bonsai-like proportions is also completely fallacious. Infant mortality in pre-modern times was ridiculously high, and you'd only need one childhood accident or disease in 2,000 years to wipe out the bloodline. If, however, even one extra sibling per generation survived to reproduce, the numbers of descendants would increase at an exponential rate. Keep the children of Christ marrying each other, on the other hand, and eventually they'd be so inbred that the sons of God would have flippers for feet. Quoting Robert Crumb, literary editor of the Observer newspaper, about the Holy Blood and the Holy Grail, there is something called historical evidence. There is something called the historical method. And if you look around the shelves of bookshops, there is a lot of history being published, and people mistake this type of history for the real thing. These kinds of books do appeal to an enormous audience who believe them to be history, but actually they aren't history. They are a kind of parody of history. Alas, though, I think that one has to say that this is the direction that history is going today.
When I first discovered the story of Rennes-le-Château back in the late 60s, almost nobody had heard of the village, and outside France nobody at all had heard of it. The story just existed as an account of a priest finding a treasure. So when I first stumbled onto it, the village was a little lost, remote peasant hamlet on the top of a mountain, peaceful. Now there's a place to park coaches. There are gift shops, bookshops, postcards, gifts. And I have to say that I'm not very happy about what's happened, but then my opinion doesn't really matter. But I find it sad to see that it's attracted not just the treasure hunting lunatics, but also people who impose all sorts of other ideas and angles of approach onto what is essentially a story which is much more important than they seem to realize. All I've done is open the door. It's for people who have the expertise, who can understand what's here, who now have got the work to do. But the background to this story, the question of why this mystery is set, where it's set, in the little village of Rennes-le-Château in the south of France, and on the island of Bornholm in the Baltic Sea, these aspects of the story don't rely on hypotheses. They are pure statements of fact. What we have uncovered is a vast body of lost knowledge.
This book is highly divisive. It will infuriate some, fascinate others, and bore many. I fall into the middle category. I couldn't put it down the first time I read it, and have reread it many times since. I'm not sure how much of it I actually believe, but I have been obsessed with it for years.
I can promise you this. The more you dig in, the more you think you understand, the more you get pushed closer to a realization that you really don't understand anything.
Thank you for listening to Eclectic Obsessions. If you like what you've heard, please subscribe on iTunes. Leave me a review. All 5-star reviews will be read on the show. You can follow the show on Facebook at Eclectic Obsessions, on Twitter at Eclectic Obsess 1, on Instagram at Eclectic Obsessions Podcast, and on YouTube at Eclectic Obsessions. I'd love to hear what you think. Feel free to email the show at ecobpod@gmail.com. We'll be back in 2 weeks with a new Eclectic Obsession.